Hello, Mr. Arlinghouse. Today is Tuesday, March the 23rd. And yes, I'm still wearing the same clothes I wore yesterday. Actually, I'm recording two of these today because, Mr. Arlinghouse, I'm beginning to be concerned that we need to keep pushing forward. And let's see, 1918, that puts us, we still have 90 years to go left, and a lot of reviewing, a lot of talking about how to do LEQs, DBQs, a lot of reviewing. I mean, the AP exam is a tough customer, Mr. Allinghouse. It is a tough customer. And so let us begin, shall we? Hopefully you looked at this YouTube here. It's 2.5 minutes, So let's begin, shall we? Yes. Roman 22, Mr. Arlinghouse. The collapse of Russia and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk were the high point of German success in World War I. After this, everything goes downhill. It is about this time, and not coincidentally, that Americans entered the war. I mean, when the Russians dropped out, it made Woodrow Wilson feel a lot better about entering World War I because you got to know Woodrow Wilson. He was a man, I think, of great irony. He was a man of great conflict. He was a man who had some really strange beliefs. For example, he really did. He saw the world in two colors, black and white, right and wrong. For example, he did not want the United States to be allied with Russia, a czarist country, which is actually, a very liberal feeling on his account. He also is the president who will give women the right to vote, and he also is the president or the person who is responsible for a lot of the countries of Europe gaining independence: Czechoslovakia, Poland, Hungary, um, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland. But on the other hand, man was an avowed racist. Uh, and he really was. I mean, Woodrow Wilson, Mr. Arlinghouse, um, during the American experience, or during the 1910s, Wilson served as president from 1912 to 1920. I say that because he was dying his last year. But during that time, there was a great wave of lynchings of African Americans that took place across the South. And the NAACP and other organizations approached Woodrow Wilson and said, as President of the United States, can't you do something about these lynchings? And in fact, the matter is, Woodrow Wilson also, he reversed some former policy decisions that actually took rights away from African Americans. But anyway, they asked Woodrow Wilson, says, can't you do something? Can't you, create a national outcry or a law about lynchings? And Wilson said, well, and of course we're talking Deep South here, that lynchings of African American was a state issue, and the states should have to handle it. But yeah. Anyway, so it was about this time that Americans entered the war. The United States entered the war in the spring of 1917. I think it was April the 4th. And but in reality, they don't start showing up in serious numbers until the latter part of the 1918. They come in really late in the war. As it says, they did not enter the war for about another year. And during that year, both sides tried to end the war before the Americans entered the fray. The Allies' offensive failed miserably as the French mutinied and losses were heavy. The Austrians defeated the Italians. And remember, the Italians now had joined up with the British, the French, and now the United States. In March of 1918, though, the Germans tried one last desperate offensive. The German army reached the Marne River in France again and got no farther. but in doing it, that was it. They had spent, their last gasp, as it says there. No more reserves, and the nation was exhausted. Not only that, but more and more the Germans were putting teenage boys, and by teenage boys I mean 14, 15, in uniform, in ill-fitting helmets and uniforms, and sending them to the front. I mean, it was the boys that had not reached their full adult maturity yet, and it was just terrible. The Allies were actually bolstered by the Americans' presence. The Americans showed up, and fresh troops, fresh attitude. They then launched counteroffensive, which was finally successful against Germany, because the Germans were simply out of soldiers. The Austrian fronts in the Balkans and in Italy collapsed. General Ludendorff felt that peace should be reached before the German army could be thoroughly defeated in the field. And he also felt that the responsibility for ending the war should fall on civilians. Ludendorff asked allowed a government to be elected under democratic principles and seek peace immediately. The new government under Prince Max von Baden, asked for a peace based on WW's 14 points. Well, we have a lot to learn, Mr. Allinghouse. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. So what are the 14 points? Okay. 14 points. Am I going to make you memorize all 14 of them, Mr. Allinghouse? That would be a trick. No, I'll tell you what. Let's do 4. Let's see. The 14 points. Wilson's 14 points were his plan for peace. Wilson! Wilson's plan for peace So, 1. Open agreements openly arrived at. In other words, no more secret treaties. Secret treaties were, two countries cut a deal with each other. And since it's a secret treaty, that actually then lessens the chance that either one of the two countries will abide by it. And if one of the countries doesn't abide by it, it's a cause for war. From now on, open agreements openly arrived at. 2. Freedom of trade and navigation on the high seas. That means you can't go into China and cut it in pieces anymore. 3, and here we go. Self-determination. This is the thing that in Eastern Europe, Mr. Allinghouse, that Woodrow Wilson was really worshipped for. I mean, you would, during this time, during the years 1917, 1918, 1919, you'd go to these little tiny homes in Eastern Europe, that might have a dirt floor, that, have a fireplace, but above the fireplace, there would be a picture, a cutout picture from a magazine or a newspaper that they had tacked above there in a place of honor above the fireplace. You would see a picture of Woodrow Wilson, the American president, in these little towns. And like I said, Mr. Allinghouse, remember that there was a statue of Woodrow Wilson. And do I have to show you again? Mr. Allinghouse? I'm paused. And we're back, Mr. Allinghouse. And yes, that picture I wanted to show you, that I probably already showed you, Mr. Allinghouse. I'm getting, in age. But yes, I took this picture myself in the city of Prague, took a train from Krakow, Poland, across the border into Prague. Beautiful, wonderful train ride. I just love taking trains in Europe. But go out of the train station and I see this. And this statue, and I was just so excited, because I'd learned about this a long time ago, Mr. Arlinghouse, in history class at Berea College. And sure enough, there's that statue. For what it's worth, yes, this statue had been erected after World War One. Of course, when the Nazis came in, they tore it down. No, I'm sorry, when the Russians came in after World War II, they tore it down. Prague, actually, in World War II, was pretty much unmolested. World War II, which is a rarity amongst European cities. But Prague was unmolested. But when the Russians took over Eastern Europe, yeah, they tore the statue down. And then, of course, when they kicked Russia out in 1991, statue returns. But yeah, I mean, and all over that railroad station, there were like the quotes of Woodrow Wilson, little facades of Woodrow Wilson. It's interesting, I think. Don't you, Mr. Arlinghouse? There it is. So, self-determination, number 3. And number 4, now we haven't mentioned this before, and I'm going to write in all caps, League, the League of Nations. Now, what is the League of Nations, Mr. Arlinghouse? We need to know this. We need to know it because of all of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. The League of Nations is the only one that in reality is made concrete. Yeah, I mean, Woodrow Wilson was in favor of self-determination, but there were lots of peoples in Europe that did not get a hearing. And not just in Europe, but also in India and Asia. Representatives of India, Gandhi, showed up at the World War I talks. And, he said, hey, how about independent India? And the British said, you're funny, Gandhi. Ho Chi Minh showed up. There were Vietnamese soldiers that fought with the French against the Germans. And Ho Chi Minh showed up and said, hey, how about an independent Vietnam? And the French said, no, monsieur. No. And so Woodrow Wilson, like I said, there were lots of people who did not gain independence at the end of World War I. So Wilson, I never did tell you what the League of Nations was. Forgive me, Mr. Arnold. The League of Nations, I mean, it was an idea. See, Wilson was just a bull. He was naive, is what he was. He was a believer in democracy. He was a believer that if people sit down and talk, that you can solve all problems. And so the League of Nations was going to be like an international legislature, a place where all the countries who belong to the League of Nations could come, and when they have differences, they argue about the differences at the table instead of shooting each other and blowing stuff up on the battlefield. And that's how it worked out, or how it was supposed to work out. And here's the 2 ironies of it. Number one, in Wilson's 14 points, he came with these 14 points. He was so optimistic. The only part of his 14 points, once again, that was made concrete, that came to pass, was the League of Nations. And here's the second irony. Even though it was the idea of the United States never joined the League of Nations. Yeah, after World War I is over with, in the United States, there will be a great cynicism across the country. Because even though the United States came into war late, Mr. Arlinghouse, and American losses were actually minimal, Mr. Arlinghouse, the people of this country were shocked. When you add to that especially that click on the heels of the World War I, you have the great Spanish flu pandemic, which began in Iowa, Kansas, one of those states. But it did. But it didn't matter. everybody in America thought it was associated with World War One. And there was a great cynicism, and the United States just didn't want anything to do. They wanted nothing to do with the rest of the world. The United States became isolationist. And the last thing the United States public wanted was to have a connection, an international connection that tied them to all these other countries. Countries like the British and French, who at the end of World War I were so very dedicated to revenge, to getting what's theirs. So, as it says there, Wilson, being the optimist that he was, insisted that he would only deal with a democratic German government because he wanted to be sure he was dealing with the German people. And Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9, 1918. The majority branch of the Social Democrats proclaimed Germany a republic to prevent the establishment of a Soviet government under the dominion of a radical party like it happened in Russia with the Leninists. 2 days later, the new government, the so-called, let's put this in parentheses, this is something you should know, Mr. Arlinghouse, the Weimar Republic, as it was called, and we'll use that term a lot, Mr. Arlinghouse, going forward, so you better remember. The Weimar Republic is the democratic government that takes over after World War I and lasts until the ascension of Adolf Hitler in 1933. So, the Weimar Republic accepted the defeat of Germany in the war. Here's the thing, from the German perspective, all during World War I, the German people were totally unaware. I mean, it wasn't in the newspapers, they didn't have radio. Totally unaware that their army was losing. Notice this, this is a very key element. When Germany surrendered, no foreign soldiers stood on German soil. And not only that, the Germans were actually occupying not just large swaths of Belgium, France, but also Poland and the Russian Empire, literally all the way to the edge of the Baltic Sea. And I mean the far edge of the Baltic Sea. And the Germans said, a lot of Germans said, why are we surrendering? But the Germans did. They surrendered. Had they not surrendered, of course, it was all about to collapse anyway. Germans had no reserves. Their soldiers were all either very old men or very young boys. They were completely worn out. They had no food. Their munitions were spent. They had no money. Many Germans expected a mild settlement. Many Germans also believed that they had been duped by the end of the war, that, they surrendered, as a sign of goodwill, that, okay, the war's over, let's all go home. But no. Yeah, the beating for Germany wasn't through yet. The victorious nations rejoiced, but it was a muted rejoicing because, the shock of the war and the tally, the cost, the lives, the wounded, the money, the property, the fact that, think of this, Mr. Arlinghouse, in Belgium and in the northeast part of France, that every spring when they begin cultivating fields again, every once in a while they'll trip over a mine. They'll dig up a piece of ordnance. Most of the times they don't explode. Most times they don't explode. But every once in a while they hit them just right. And and it's been 100 years since that war. I could sit here and talk for a while about the cause of Princess Diana. She really was a crusader against mines, landmines, because there are millions of landmines all planted in the ground all over. For example, in Vietnam, there are at least 13 children that get injured every month from landmines. Yeah. And Vietnam's not even the worst one. You're talking about places like Pakistan, Afghanistan, uh, Central and South America, places like that. Oh, of course, Iraq, you know. And I'm getting off the subject, but the fact of the matter is, the great loss. Casualties came to 10 million dead. That means 10 million soldiers. 10 million soldiers dead and twice as many wounded. The victorious Allies, who had in 1914 been creditors to the world, now were indebted. And see, that's worth noting. That's going to come up. That is going to come up in the next chapter. Yeah, I mean, the British and the French, everybody used to owe them money. Well, now they owed money to the United States. The Great War had the following consequences: 4 million dead, 8.3 million wounded amongst the Central Powers. That's Germany, Austria, Ottoman Empire. 5.4 million dead and 7 million from the Allies. The Ottoman, Russian, and German and Austrian empires gone. Yes. Now, that's not to say that Turkey didn't exist after this, Russia or Germany or Austria, but the empires were gone, dismembered, taken apart. The Americans entered the war and into European affairs like never before. And actually, that's going to last. Yeah, the Americas' entry into European affairs, that'll become a permanent thing. Even though for a while the Americans tried to back off, the world has gotten smaller. The collapse of the Russian Empire brought communism into the mainstream. Also, World War I brought fascism to Germany, Spain, and Italy. It is widely agreed that World War I was the mother of the Second World War. In fact, World War I wasn't called World War I until the Second World War. And most of the horrors for the rest of the 20th century. Yes. World War I is the mother of all that. The grandfather of what happened for example, in Bosnia, Serbia, and Herzegovina during the 90s. World War I. Europe was no longer the center of the world, free to interfere when it wished or to ignore the world if it chose. Yeah, see, once again, that's why World War I, 1914, is the end of the age of Europe. Yeah. The details of the Treaty of Versailles were hammered out in the first half of 1919. The Big Four negotiators, Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, George Clemenceau of France, and to a lesser degree, Vittorio Emanuele of Italy. This guy here, Clemenceau, he was Wilson's worst nightmare. So, their job was much more difficult than that of the Congress of Vienna a century earlier. The Congress of Vienna, for example, concerned only Europe. In the Napoleonic Wars, France had admitted defeat. And the earlier summit was not subject to public opinion. This conference, the Paris Peace Agreement, Treaty of Versailles, was much different. In 1918, public opinion was a thing in a world of democracies. Nationalism had become almost a secular religion, and the many ethnic groups of Europe could no longer be counted on to remain quiet anymore. World War I had also been transformed into some sort of moral crusade against the bad Germans for a just peace as well as a secure one. The 14 points had emphasized self-determination, which was at best a pipe dream, given the current map of Europe. You say, what does that mean, Mr. Horton? Well, it's not possible for every ethnic group to have their own country. Some ethnic groups are scattered out all over the place, like the Slavs, the Germans, The Germans, of course, most of them live in what we now call Germany proper, but there were pockets of Germans scattered out all over Europe, for example, in the Sudetenland, for example, in Slovakia, for example. Wilson's idealism, because he was an idealist. He was naive, is a better word. Came into direct confrontation with the practical war aims and secret deals that had been cut during the war. Britain and France had been making deals right and left. And remember, it was a secret deal, the Zimmerman Note, that had brought the Americans into the war. Population of Britain and France had been told that the Germans would pay monetarily for the war. Russia had, Horn, can't you write? Horton had been promised Constantinople in return for France's acquisition of the Alsace-Lorraine and British control of Egypt. Of course, Russia's not going to get it because Russia quit. Romania also had been promised a part of Hungary. Some agreements conflicted with others. Italy and Serbia had conflicting claims on the islands in the shoreline of the Adriatic Sea. The British had encouraged Arab aspirations of independence from the Ottoman Empire. That sentiment then went against the British Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration was a promise by the British that said that there should be a Jewish homeland. But when the British are saying, hey, you Arabs should have your own state, that went against the Balfour Declaration. The British and French had also agreed to divide these lands amongst themselves, which they did. In other words, they told a lot of lies during the war. Here's something for you. It is said that the first casualty of war, Mr. Allinghouse, remember these words, the first casualties of war, Mr. Allinghouse, is always the truth. France was very cognizant of the fact that it had fewer people than Germany, and that gap was going to widen because the French quit having kids, given the low French birth rate, so they wanted to do everything in their power to make the Germans weak long into the future. Italy continued to desire what they called Italia Irredenta, in other words, an Italian empire. Britain wanted to continue to expand their empire. Japan also wanted an Asian empire. I mean, in fact, the reason why Japan got in the war in the first place, they didn't care about, European concerns. Japan got into the war to acquire territory. They wanted to expand their land holdings in the Pacific Ocean. The United States insisted upon freedom of navigation, the Monroe Doctrine, which the Monroe Doctrine is an imperialist doctrine. Then there was the rise of Bolshevism and communism. Let me say this right now, Mr. Allinghouse. Yes. Keep in mind the book by George Orwell, Animal Farm. We'll talk about that later. George Orwell's book Animal Farm is and I'm losing it, Mr. Allinghouse. It's an allegory, yes. George Orwell's book Animal Farm is an allegory where the creatures in the book represent something else. George Orwell's book Animal Farm is about the rise of communism. the pigs were the communists. If you've read the book George Orwell's Animal Farm, which in Boone County, I mean, when I first came here, all freshman classes read Animal Farm. It's a allegory about communism. So, the Allies had tried to send armies to thwart the Bolsheviks, but to no avail. And many of those soldiers sent there were Americans who died, never came back. Communism set up governments in Bavaria and Hungary. Berlin had a communist uprising led by the so-called Spartacus group. I've seen that on somebody's test. Yeah. The Allies, I said that, Mr. Allinghouse, somebody's test. The Allies supported the suppression of such activities with force. They even allowed German volunteers to fight against the Bolsheviks in the Baltic states. Communism did arouse some attention, but it was the fear of the rise of Germany, again, that dominated the Paris Peace Conference. And Mr. Allinghouse, I think it is time for us to stop. Okay? So I will see you tomorrow, Wednesday. And with Wednesday, goodness, this is a long chapter, don't you think, Mr. Allinghouse? Yeah, it's a long chapter. Goodbye.